For a working steam engine, you need to have steam pushing against a piston, moving it up a boiler, and you need to have a way of cooling the steam down so you create a partial vacuum so the water is sucked into the empty space. Now for those things to happen, you need three elements. You need a reliable cylinder for the piston to move up and down, and that cylinder comes from exactly the same technology as making guns, making the barrels of cannon. In order to get a constant, reliable supply of steam, you need some kind of boiler, a distillation apparatus, and there's a very close relationship between boilers and steam engines and distillation. And finally, you need a feedback mechanism. You need a way of turning that motion into a useful one, and that comes from gearing, clockwork. So it's the combination of clockwork and making cannon and distillation and brewing that provide the basic skills from which steam engine technology emerges. In order for the different skills of clockmaking and brewing and distilling and gun founding to come together, you need deliberate, ingenious coordination. And that's what Britain had at the end of the 17th and the beginning of the 18th century. Because on the one hand, you had major demand for the kinds of things that steam engines could do. They could pump water from deep mines, which was just what the English tin and coal mines needed. You needed plentiful supplies of raw materials like coal and iron, but above all, you needed places where these things could be pulled together under a single system. And that meant in the places where the guns were being made, where metal was being forged, and where there was a group of skilled artisans, clockmakers, gear cutting, and so on. And really only England at the turn of the 17th and 18th century had that combination of skills sufficiently well coordinated with immediate demand for the output, for pumps and the other things that steam engines could run. The idea of a steam engine is old and shared by many cultures. It isn't an English monopoly to think that steam can push pistons, or that by boiling water you might be able to lift weights and run pumps. What's unique about the British experience is that you get very large numbers of relatively cheap engines being made very quickly and then applied across a relatively large national space. The steam revolution of the 17th and early 18th century in Britain is unique because of its speed, because of the scale on which it was implemented, and because of the high technology that was required, not just for building any kind of steam engine, but for building engines that were reliable, that would represent a return on investment. And it's that mixture of skill, precision, and reliability that I think singles out the British case from any other case that we know. The necessary kind of social environment that you need to pull together these skills and realize these investments is one which has a relatively high degree of economic competition, so that marginal advantage will be immensely profitable. And that means if I can dig a slightly deeper mine than my neighbor, it is absolutely worth my while spending the money on an engine to run the pump that will enable me to dig deeper. And that means you have to have a culture of neighborly and intense competition. And I think that starts to pick out the British case. Alongside that, you need very rapid transfer of information and skill so that artisans can be mobile. There's a lot of evidence, for example, that right through the early decades of the 18th century, if you didn't have an English engineer, you couldn't get a steam engine like Newcomen's engines to work. So skills are carried around by people at least as much as they are by written instructions, and you need lots of social mobility. So, lots of social mobility. It's absolutely rewarding to have a small advantage over your neighbor, and you think of your neighbor as your competitor. If you start to put those social factors together, you're starting to pick out what's unique about northwestern Europe in general, and England in particular, I think.